Wow, Brother Pierre, yeah, God has gifted you with just such a beautiful voice. Thank you so much for blessing us. It was the night of April 14. The ocean liner Californian had drawn to within 1,500 miles of her destination, Boston Harbor. Second Officer Herbert Stone was due for watch on the bridge. When he arrived, he had found his apprentice, this apprentice seaman, glued to a pair of binoculars staring toward the black horizon. He asked what was going on, and the man said he had seen some white flashes in the night sky in the direction of a distant steamer. They could make out some of the lights of the steamer, and they weren't sure what was going on, but they both watched, and over a period of time, there were 3 or 4 different white flashes in the night sky. But then the steamer seemed to be sailing away, and the white flashes ceased. Second Officer Stone dismissed his apprentice and took over the watch. Neither the apprentice nor Second Officer Stone had felt that the white flashes in the night sky were any cause for alarm. They didn't read in what was flashing in the sky as cries for help, and yet they were. They would have been able to understand much better that the distant steamer was actually in trouble and was asking for help for any other ship in that area of the sea on that night to come to her rescue and to her aid. They would have understood that much more clearly had they received the radio messages that were coming in, because that distant steamer was sending out radio signals of alarm, pleading for help as well. But unfortunately, the radio operator on board the Californian was fast asleep in his cabin and never heard the cries for help. The Californian was parked, if you can use that term, on the ocean, not too far away, parked that night because they were concerned about an immense field of oceanic ice. Thus it was that Second Officer Stone, unwittingly, had a ringside seat for the sinking of the Titanic, would have been close enough to provide some aid. But because they didn't hear the cries for help, they did not. There was another night on another body of water, large lake, some call it a sea, where another one slept. And because he slept, lives were placed in peril. People wondered, don't you care? And it's that scene that interests me this evening. You know the story well. It is told in more than one gospel. We're going to look at it from the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 4. As we look at it, we're going to look at it by asking a question. I heard this story all throughout my childhood and youth, even into my adulthood as a pastor. But it wasn't until years ago, reading it again more thoughtfully and carefully, that it struck me that there are two questions that I would like to ask of the participants of that night's drama on the lake. They are two how could you kinds of questions. You know how could you questions, don't you? We say they're questions that I wonder if they really are. It's almost that they're more statements of blame. They're blaming you, the other person, but they're disguised as questions. You know, it's like the question you asked of your grandchild when she brought her geography test home. her geography test, she was very proud. She had done very well. In fact, she had gotten almost every question right except one. She showed you. There on the paper before you was a map of the continent of Africa. And she was supposed to identify the different countries. And she did an almost perfect job. But she missed that one down in the south. She got it wrong. And you looked at that and you said, sweetheart, how could you miss that? That's South Africa. That's where we live. How could you miss that one? That's a how could you question. Or it's a question that you, as a wife, asked of your husband yesterday afternoon. You told him, run to the market. I've got to have you get two things I need to finish up my preparations for tomorrow's Sabbath lunch. Please hurry, I need them soon. I need some cream and I need some celery. Fixing a dessert, fixing a salad. Please hurry. He goes off. He's gone an hour and 15 minutes. You're thinking, what happened to him? He comes back. He's got eggs. He's got bread. He's got cottage cheese. And you're saying, where's the celery? Where's the cream? Oh, I forgot. And you say, how could you? That's the reason I sent you. How could you forget that? So that's the kind of question I would like to ask of that participant, those nights, the participants of that night's drama on the lake. How could you questions? I know we say they're not really questions, they're statements of blame, but we'll play along and say they're questions. Two how could you questions I want to ask. But first we have to read the story. Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, beginning with verse 35. Here's how Mark records the story. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. The wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. The first how could you question I would like to ask of the disciples. And having spent a fair bit of time reading the Gospels, and having noticed who usually speaks up, I suspect I would probably fall into conversation with Peter. Peter's the one who's always talking, asking questions no one dares ask, answering questions no one's asking, sticking his foot in his mouth, blustering, blundering Peter. I suspect I would end up in conversation with Peter. Here's the question I would like to ask him. I'd like to say to him, Peter, you've spent some time now with this man. You've seen the kind of person that he is. You've seen the dramatic things he does. You've seen him feed people, heal people, give sight to blind eyes, give speech to mute tongues. You've seen it. You've watched it. You've watched him hold the crowd in the palm of his hand as he teaches them. This is no mere ordinary man, Peter. So, Peter, I just have to ask you, how could you? How could you possibly be afraid when Jesus was in the boat? He was right there with you. How could you be afraid? Now, I wonder how Peter would answer that question. Maybe Peter would say, well, Randy, I mean, come on, it was a storm. It was a rough storm. But we're fishermen, we're men of the sea, we know exactly how to handle it. So when the storm came up, we just took care of doing all the things we needed to do. Rowing, bailing, getting the boat headed into the waves. We knew what to do. But this was more than we had ever seen. And despite everything we could do, we just couldn't do it. And I guess we figured if we can't do it as men of the sea, he can't do it. He's a teacher. Maybe that's what Peter would say. Or maybe Peter would focus even more on the intensity and the fury of the storm. Maybe he would say, as men of the sea, we have ridden out countless storms on this very same lake. We've been here. We know exactly what it's like. We know exactly what to do. We know exactly how the wind can come whipping down through the canyons surrounding the Sea of Galilee. We know how it can whip the waves into a fury. We know that if you can ride it out for a certain period of time, it will finally calm and you'll be okay. We know all of that. But in this case, it had become so intense that it just wasn't to be ridden out. There was no end to it. And it was so overwhelming that we just realized there is no way out of this. And it didn't matter who was there. I mean, come on. Feeding the crowd is one thing. Calming the sea? So yeah, it scared us. I'll be honest with you. Maybe that's what Peter would say. Or maybe he would say, Randy, we got so caught up in trying to keep that boat afloat, so desperate to survive this storm, so wrapped up in what had to be done. And I'm embarrassed to admit it, but we just forgot he was there. We forgot he was in the boat. The book Desire of Ages records these words about that night. The sun had set, and the blackness of night settled down upon the stormy sea. The waves, lashed into a fury by the howling winds, dashed fiercely over the disciples' boat and threatened to engulf it. Those hardy fishermen had spent their lives upon the lake and had guided their craft safely through many a storm, but now their strength and skill availed nothing. They were helpless in the grasp of the tempest, and hope failed them as they saw their boat was filling. Absorbed in their efforts to save themselves, they had forgotten that Jesus was on board. Now, I've read enough of the gospel accounts to know that Peter is not the kind of person you want to back into a corner. Because when Peter feels threatened, he'll come out swinging, usually with a sword in his hand, and you better watch your ears. So Peter doesn't like getting backed into corners. So I suspect that if I was in conversation with Peter, about this point in time, he'd say, hey, wait a minute. What do you mean? How could I forget? How could I forget that Jesus was in the boat? You're asking me that question, Randy? Seriously? Well, let me ask you a question. You remember that time you were flying on American Airlines through Dallas-Fort Worth Airport? You remembered how a jet had crashed there some years before when you were a student nearby? And you know that it crashed because it hit wind shear, slammed it into the turf. And you're flying in and you're coming down on descent and the jet hits an air pocket. I think you had to swallow your heart just to be able to breathe, Randy. The panic was on your face. Let me ask you, how could you be afraid, Randy? Doesn't Jesus fly American Airlines? How could you be afraid? Or that time the doctor removed a spot on your back. Didn't say much about it. Just said, we need to get this biopsied. And you left that office, heart pounding, remembering all the stories of patients you have visited in the hospitals, wondering about cancer. It was on your face, Randy. You were afraid. Peter says, how could you be afraid? Doesn't Jesus walk the hallways of Loma Linda Hospital? How could you? Well, it's right about there in our conversation that I say to Peter, okay, Peter, all right, let's call a truce here. I won't ask you any how could you questions if you don't ask me any how could you questions. So fine. We've both forgotten at times. Let's just let that lie. But I do have a second question I want to ask. This one is not of the disciples, not even of Peter. This is a question I would like to ask of Jesus. A how could you question? Now, I want to do it with respect. He is our Lord and Master. But I still want to ask it of him. In fact, maybe I would preface it just a bit so it doesn't sound quite so hard. Maybe I would preface it by admitting, you know, Jesus, I've never been in a boat, in a storm, at sea. Never. In fact, probably the closest I've been is doing whale watching off the coast of San Diego, just to the south of us. And that day, the sea was a little bit rough, not terrible, but the boat was doing this and that. And pretty soon I was feeding the fishes, not looking at the fishes. I was so sick. So I've never been in a storm at sea, Jesus. So I can't tell you with certainty what I would do. I'd probably hang onto the side. I'd probably do, they say, keep looking at the sky. I'd breathe deeply, fresh air. I'd probably try all those things. I'd probably pray. I'd probably panic. I'd probably pray and panic. There are a lot of things I can imagine that I might do, Jesus. But Jesus, if I'm in a boat, in a storm, at sea, and the boat is about to go down, I can guarantee you, there is one thing I would not be doing, and that is sleeping. Guaranteed. So Jesus, with all due respect, I have to ask you, how could you sleep? The boat's about to go down. I wonder how Jesus would answer that. Maybe Jesus would say, you know, Randy, I've always been a deep sleeper, really deep sleeper, ever since I was a kid. My mother had the hardest, Jesus, get up, you're going to be late. I'm a deep sleeper. I doubt Jesus would say that. Or maybe he would say, Randy, it had been a tough day. Read the story. It had been a day filled with crowds and people, everybody wanting a piece of me, grabbing at me, touching me. Jesus, Jesus, heal me. Do this for my father, our child. Jesus. I had been teaching all day, healing all day. The people were pressed upon me. Randy, by the time I got into that boat, I was so utterly exhausted. By the time my head hit that cushion and I fell asleep, I don't think I would have awakened had the boat gone down. I was just that tired. Maybe Jesus would say that. You know, I've noticed something about Jesus as I read the gospel accounts. Jesus, in common rabbinic fashion from his day, had this way of interacting with people that was curious. People would come to him and would ask him a question. He would listen to their question. Then he would ask them a question. And their answer, that would stand. That would be their answer. Jesus, they said, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Taxes? Huh. You're asking me about taxes. You have a coin? Sure, yeah, here's a coin. So whose image is that? Well, that's Caesar's. Well, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. To God what's God's. Wow. Jesus, we have a question for you, very important. John the Baptist, where did he get his authority? Oh, authority, I see. You're asking me about authority. That's curious. You may even want to know about my authority, huh? Yes, where did you get your authority? You're throwing people out of the temple, you're taking over the temple grounds. Where did you get your authority? Well, Jesus says, let's go back to John. Let me ask you a question about John. Just where did John get his authority? Just a moment, give us a moment. And they huddle. Well, if we say he got it from people, no, we can't do that. Everybody, if we say he got it from God, no, we can't do that. Jesus, we don't know. We don't know. Ah, okay, well, if you don't answer my question, I won't answer yours. I mean, Jesus did this kind of thing. And I come to him, Jesus, how could you sleep when the boat's about to go down? Maybe he would say, Randy, let me ask you a question. Do you remember in your early to mid teenage years when your family lived in Guadalajara, Mexico? Oh, I remember that, Jesus. Do you remember those long driving trips you all would take from Guadalajara to Keene, Texas, and then from Keene, Texas back to Guadalajara? Oh man, I've tried to forget them, but I remember. So what do you remember about those trips? Well, I remember that my dad, when he got behind the wheel of a car, had one goal in mind, and that was get to the destination. He didn't want to stop for anything. I mean, we had to stop to get gas. We wouldn't have made it. We had to stop for the border. There are these little things called laws. We had to stop for those, but beyond that, he didn't want to stop. We would drive day and night. In fact, I have distinct memories of my mother and my little sister saying, there's a restroom. And Dad would say, oh, I hate to go back. There's bound to be one just up the way. Oh, I remember. We drove all the time. In fact, I remember, Jesus, that as long as it was daylight, my sister and I had things to do. This was way before iPads and cell phones, none of that. We would read, we would watch the passing scenery, we would engage in our favorite pastime, fight. Our parents were like, "Stop that back there." I would draw a line on the back seat, tell my sister, "You cross that line, you won't live to see Texas." So we did all that kind of stuff, Jesus, until the sun went down. And when the sun went down, there wasn't anything else to do. I mean, those were dangerous roads in that day and time in Mexico, usually 2-lane, up and down mountains into canyons, people, animals walking on the road, beside the road, terrible crashes. Many people died. But we would drive on through the night. And when the night came, there was nothing else to do. My sister and I would fall fast asleep in the back seat. And Jesus says to me, "Randy, even as a teenager, you knew the risks. You knew how dangerous it could be. So let me ask you, Randy, how could you sleep?" I say, "Well, Jesus, that's an easy question to answer. My father was a good driver. I trusted him." And Jesus says, "Yeah, mine too. He's a good captain of ships and seas and souls." I read a story about a woman in World War II London, elderly woman. The city was being bombed to pieces around her, and yet she seemed strangely at peace. Someone asked her, "How are you at peace? How do you sleep at night? The bombing." She said, "Well, you see, it's this way. Bedtime, I kneel by my bed and I place my life in the hands of God, ask him to be with me, to care for me. And then I figured there's no use both of us staying up, so I go to bed." Now that's the best place, honestly, to end. By saying that despite the fact that we sometimes forget, the truth is simple. Jesus is still in the boat. And because he is, we can rest our lives in his providential love. But I don't quite think I can end there. Because if I ended there, we would end the Zoom meeting and I would leave a question hanging in the air. I would go eat breakfast and I would be thinking about Adele. I'd be thinking about others on this Zoom call. And the fact that you have a question for me that you haven't gotten to ask. It's a how could you question. You're sitting there saying, "Randy, that's all nice and good. But Randy, how could you? How could you suggest to us in a fractured, fractious, dangerous world that we can rest in the providence of God? There's violence on every hand. There's uncertainty looming in the future. There are diseases which medical science has not conquered. My future is not guaranteed." How could you do that? How could you suggest that we could rest? Well, let me attempt an answer. You see, the world in which Jesus and the disciples lived was in many ways dramatically different from our world. One of those ways, as it touches this story, is in how they understood the sea. They refer to it often as the deep. How they understood the deep. See, they didn't have what we have. They didn't have a mask and snorkels, fins to be able to see what was down there. They didn't have scuba diving equipment to dive deeply. They didn't have underwater cameras and submarines to map the terrain under the ocean. They didn't know for sure all that was down there. And because of that, many suspicions and superstitions had grown up about the deep. The deep was considered to be the place of chaos, of darkness, of evil, of demons, of the demonic powers. You see this even in the book of Job, talking about the chaos of the deep. So those disciples, when they bobbed in that boat on the lake, they weren't just trying to save their temporal lives. Oh, they were trying to do that. They wanted to survive, no mistake about it. But there was something far deeper, far darker, far more sinister at work in their minds. This battle was the battle between good and evil, darkness and light. This storm was the evil one extending a spiny, bony hand out of the deep, trying to grasp that little boat and its precious cargo and plunge it into the depths of a spiritual night that would never dawn. And then, in the midst of that storm, that Galilean rabbi, that itinerant preacher, stands in the bow of the boat and says, "Peace, be still." And like a mighty giant slowly crumbling to his knees on the battlefield, evil and darkness obey. The disciples were afraid before. They're terrified now. Who is this with this kind of power? Power even over evil. You know, it was not that many months later that Jesus faced another storm, the ultimate storm. This storm he faced at a place called Calvary. This time his boat was a cross. And this time in the storm, his boat went down. But it went down with Jesus in it. And when it went down, it went all the way down. All the way down to the deepest, darkest cave of the deep. And when his boat hit bottom, Jesus pulled the plug. He opened the drain. And that old sea began to drain. It continues draining. Even today, even in South Africa, even in the UK, even in Southern California. And it will continue to drain. So much so that one of the participants in the boat that night on the lake would one day on an isle called Patmos get a new vision of a new heaven and a new earth. And when he did, he would put his quill pen to parchment and he would write and say, "And I, John, saw a new heaven and a new earth, and there was no more sea." Drain dry. Jesus is in the boat. So when you ask me, "Randy, how could you in a broken world suggest that we can rest in the eternal providence of God? I guess my answer is simple. How could I not? Because the truth is simple. Because Jesus trusted, I can too. Because Jesus triumphed, I will too. Gracious God, we magnify, we honor, and we bless your name. We thank you that you are in the boat, so that whether it floats or goes down, you are in it with us. And we are guaranteed then to arrive on that eternal shore, where no sea will ever threaten us, no sea will ever separate us again. In the name of Jesus, amen.